Hello everyone, this is Damon with Easy Green Screen. For this tutorial, we'll be discussing the composition menu in Easy Green Screen. This is where you can add a background. You can also position and scale your foreground in relationship to the background, as well as adjust the lighting for your foreground and your background. The first thing we'll do is add a backdrop here. You'll need to find the folder that contains your background image. I'm already there for my computer. You highlight that and hit OK, or you can double click it as well. That is going to import the background into our image. The next thing we're going to do is scale and position the foreground. Now for this image, I want to make the foreground smaller in relationship to the background. But what we have to do is actually increase the size of the background canvas to accomplish that. And I'll just demonstrate here and go to 105%. The reason it is set up this way is because Easy Green Screen works in a non-destructive environment, and there's a lot of layers with the foreground while Easy Green Screen is running. So instead, what we do, instead of resizing the foreground, we want to leave that alone. The background is converted to a smart object, so you can resize the foreground or resize the background as many times as you want, and it's going to do that non-destructively, so you don't damage the image if you go too far down on the scale and then move it back up. Now when we apply this, we have the choice of changing how we're scaling that. We'll be discussing this in a few minutes here. So the next thing we'll want to do is position the foreground. I'm just going to move this -50. So for the left and right, negative goes to the left and positive goes to the right. I'll also show you the up-down slider. Negative pushes it down, positive pushes it up. We'll just go back to 0. So I think that the foreground is positioned pretty good where it's at. So the next thing I want to do is adjust the lighting in this image. And what I want to do is make it look like this image was shot on location. And so I want to balance the lighting between the foreground and the background. So we have a nighttime background and our foreground was shot in a studio, and I want to make this look more like it was shot at nighttime. So I'm going to go into the composition menu, and I'm going to start by adjusting the foreground lighting. And usually you'll adjust one or the other and make most of your adjustments on one or the other. And since I want this image to look like it was shot at night, I want to adjust my foreground to make the lighting more like it was nighttime. I'm just going to adjust the white balance down a little bit. That's a pretty subtle adjustment, but a nighttime shot's not going to be quite as warm on the colors. I'm going to adjust the saturation down a little bit, as well as the brightness. Maybe a little more on the brightness. So you can see now that the foreground has a much better blend into the background as far as the coloring matching a little bit better. And I'll show you also, you could go in and adjust the background lighting as well. So if we wanted to brighten the background up just a bit, we could. And also we could adjust the contrast of the background, make it more or less. And in this case, with a nighttime background, we might want a little bit more contrast. And maybe turn the saturation down just a bit on this one. So you can really just dial in the lighting between your background and your foreground. Now this contrast bias, what this does is if you push it to the highlights, the further up you go, the less of an effect that contrast has in the shadow areas, and it's only being affected on the highlights. And if you push it toward the shadows, it's going to affect the shadows more than the highlights. I'll just demonstrate that here. I'll go -100. And so if we push this contrast way up, you notice these bright highlighted areas, they're not really brightening up as you would expect by pushing the contrast up, because our biasing is set to the shadows. And as soon as we start moving this up, you see those areas now brighten. And it works the opposite way, going in the other direction. Now you see that our shadows are not darkening, but our highlights are brightening with that biasing. And you don't usually use the biasing too often, but it's pretty handy if you want to use it. or if you need to. So anyway, I think we got a pretty good composition here. The lighting looks like a pretty good match. You can also reset the background lighting from the background lighting window. If you go into the foreground lighting, you can do the same. Or from the composition menu, you can reset the lighting for both foreground and background here. And I'll just demonstrate if I click that. Now our lighting is reset. So if you go in, they're all zeroed out for both the background and the foreground. And then also, I'll go back into our positioning and show you if you want to restart on your scaling and your positioning. We've got a reset scaling and positioning. And this just sets the background scale back to 100% and it recenters your foreground. And I'll actually move this back to about where it was here. And then I want to show you, I'm not going to worry about redoing the lighting, but I want to show you here on your final scaling that the whole time we've been scaling, this background has been kept as a smart object and the foreground has not been resized. So that way all of our scaling happens on the background non-destructively. However, most often is the case where you have your background sized to the print dimensions and the resolution that you want, and you want your final composition to be the size of that background. So this final scaling, this is what happens when you hit the apply button. And by default, it's scale foreground. So what it's going to do is resize the image to the exact dimensions of the background and then scale your foreground so that your final composition is the dimensions of your background. You can also choose to scale your foreground as a smart object. And you also have the choice of scaling your background either in normal mode or as a smart object in your final scaling. And what that will do is it will keep your foreground the original size and scale your background accordingly. And then for your final scaling mode, you can choose either bicubic or bicubic automatic. And by default, it's on bicubic automatic. I'm just going to demonstrate here. We're going to scale our foreground, not use a smart object, just a normal scale. And we're going to hit apply. It's finalizing the extraction now and doing the scaling it needs to do. And so if I look at our image size here, this 3000 by 2400 pixels, that was the original size of that background image, and this foreground has actually been downsized accordingly. Now, since I chose to export all layers, we could have chose to export this either as a single layer or as a dual layer, but I had all layers checked on my main window. So you get all of your adjustment layers from Easy Green Screen, and you also have your contrast and saturation, white balance layers. These are the layers from the foreground lighting in the composition. You also have your layers from the background lighting in your composition. So this is all done non-destructively. That lighting that we applied, we can uncheck and undo that. Although I already undid it before I applied it in Easy Green Screen, so these right now are not doing anything anyway. But in the case where you decided you wanted to turn the lighting off, you could do that right here if you export with all of your layers. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you're interested at all in Easy Green Screen, please be sure to visit our website. That's easygreenscreen.com.